In 1945, deep within the rigid walls of a government-run Indian boarding school in the American Southwest, 3 Native American sisters vanished without a trace. Their names were Natsi, Alisi, and Aylin, though the institution quickly replaced those with English ones, Sarah, Naomi, and Eva. One spring morning they were photographed sitting on the steps of a chapel. The very next day, they were gone. No announcements, no police reports, no outcry, just silence. At a time when the world celebrated the end of World War II, their disappearance passed unnoticed by the outside world. But one person never stopped looking: Thomas Red Elk, their older brother. For 40 long years he carried the weight of their absence, chasing fragments of memory and rumors scattered across the desert, until, in 1985, he stumbled upon something unexpected, something buried, a finding that would rip open a wound the country had tried to forget and bring to light a chilling truth hidden beneath the promises of progress. The dry wind rustled across the cracked soil of Whispering Rock, New Mexico, stirring up clouds of dust and memory. It rattled loose shingles from abandoned buildings and whispered through the broken glass windows of forgotten storefronts. There, beside a rusted 1971 camper parked near the edge of town, sat Thomas Red Elk, 58 years old, shoulders heavy, face creased by time and sorrow. Though the world knew him as Thomas, the name given at birth was Ashki Yaji, a name that meant beloved son in the language of his people. It had been stripped away by the boarding school that tried to make him someone else. Tried, but failed. He held tight to fragments of his identity, clinging to them like driftwood in a storm. The beer bottle in his hand was nearly empty, warm from the sun. His eyes, clouded and bloodshot, were fixed not on the horizon, but on the folded newspaper resting on his lap. The paper, yellowed and delicate, was dated from the mid-1000, 940s. Its headline declared, "Indian Boarding Schools, Forging America's Bright Future." Beneath it, a photograph. Black and white, frozen in time, 3 little girls sat primly on the wooden steps of a chapel. Dark hair braided neatly, white cotton dresses starched and spotless. Their faces were solemn, almost reverent to the untrained eye. But Thomas knew better. He'd studied that image thousands of times. He could feel their fear through the photograph. Behind them stood a priest in black robes, slightly out of focus, but unmistakably present. He held a Bible in one hand, in the other, a calm smile, the kind that comforted outsiders but sent a chill through those who lived under his authority. Sarah had her hands folded like their grandmother taught her, though it wasn't her real name. She had been born a Nazi, named during the spring floods, the One Who Flows. Naomi, whose left shoulder still bore the signs of an old injury, was really Alisi, she who is precious. And the youngest, Ava just 8 in the photo, was Ayelen, joyful light. Their names were poems tied to tradition and memory. The school erased them, just as it tried to erase everything else. Cottonwood Bluffs had been their home until the Bureau of Indian Affairs came with documents, lies, and promises of a better life. Their father was taken away, accused of resisting land seizure, and their mother died giving birth to Aylin. The government called it a policy. Thomas called it theft. He had been only 14 when they were dragged away. He remembered standing in the dust, powerless, as strangers loaded his baby sisters into a government vehicle. Wards of the state, they were called. But they weren't protected, they were prisoners. St. Gertrude's boarding school operated more like a correctional facility than a place of learning. The boys were kept far from the girls. Speaking Da, their native tongue, was forbidden. Any attempts to communicate in it earned beatings or confinement in the cold, damp basement. Thomas caught glimpses of his sisters only during morning mass and evening devotionals. Even then, eye contact was discouraged. The school believed that love between siblings made assimilation harder, and they were right. The day that haunted him most came in the spring of 1945. The war in Europe was ending, but within St. Gertrude's, the battle against culture and identity raged on. The school had been preparing for weeks for what they called a press day. The children were bathed, dressed, and arranged like museum pieces. The youngest, especially the girls, were placed front and center. Thomas had seen the cameras. the way the reporters asked rehearsed questions while priests stood by, nodding in satisfaction. He'd watched his sisters sit on the chapel steps, their hands trembling ever so slightly. The priest called their fearful expressions devout. The journalists called it progress. The next day, their seats at morning mass were empty. At first he thought it was an illness or punishment. By evening, panic had taken hold. He asked the guardians, begged even, but their only response was violence. They beat him, called him disrespectful, and locked him in the basement for 3 full days. When they finally let him out, they told him something that chilled his blood. You never had sisters. That was the moment something broke in him. At 18, he fled the school under the cover of darkness. No one tried hard to find him. After all, he was just another Indian boy lost to the wild American expanse. No official notice was filed, no searches conducted, no justice pursued. For 4 decades, Thomas chased shadows across the Southwest. He lived in his camper, following rumors, fragments of old letters, and whispers in the wind. He showed that photograph to reservation elders, to former students, to anyone who would look. Most turned away. Some stared too long. A few whispered that he should stop asking dangerous questions. He worked when he could, roofing, wiring, fixing engines. His hands were strong even if his heart was breaking. He sometimes stayed in veteran shelters despite never serving. He found comfort in the company of men who'd also survived battles they didn't choose. Whispering Rock wasn't where he found answers. It was where the search ran dry. The town, once a hopeful outpost, had faded to dust. Its people had moved on. But he stayed. Not because of hope, but because it matched how he felt inside. Empty, weathered, forgotten. That photograph never left his side. He folded it with care and stored it in the passenger seat like a relic. The girl's eyes, frozen in black and white, still looked back at him across time and tragedy. He took one last sip from the bottle, now warm and flat. It did little to dull the edge of memory, but it made his hands steadier. His eyes closed, and for a moment he saw them again. Not as ghosts, but as girls, laughing, running through the fields of Cottonwood Bluffs. And then he opened them, the sun setting in the distance. Another day gone, another evening alone with a silence that refused to let go. He slid into the driver's seat of his sun-bleached camper, the cracked vinyl groaning under his weight. With a practiced motion, Thomas Red Elk turned the ignition key, and the engine sputtered to life like an old man waking from a restless sleep. Wheezing, protesting, but still hanging on. He sat for a moment, letting the engine warm up, then guided the rickety vehicle down the dusty road toward town. His destination was only 10 minutes away, the liquor store. Whispering Rock's only one, small and worn, yet steadfast like everything else in the town that time had passed by. He knew Marta would be working the register. She always did. Her shifts were as reliable as the sun rising over the mesa. The bell above the liquor store door gave a metallic chime as Tommy stepped inside, the cool air brushing his face like a sigh of relief. Behind the counter, Marta Dane looked up and greeted him with a smile that carried a rare kind of warmth, one unmarred by pity or disdain. She was in her early 60s, her gray hair pulled tightly into a neat bun, her eyes soft but sharp with the wisdom of a life fully lived. They were eyes that had seen suffering and, more importantly, had learned to recognize it in others. "Tommy," she said with a gentle Spanish lilt, "let me guess. The beer ran out again?" He managed a tired smile, the corners of his mouth twitching with amusement and shame. Marta was one of the very few souls in Whispering Rock who saw him as more than just another broken-down man with a drinking problem. She spoke to him like he mattered, like he wasn't just a ghost haunting the aisles of her store. "You know me too well, Marta," he replied, walking past shelves of dusty wine bottles and expired snack packs toward the cooler at the back. He grabbed a 6-pack of the cheapest beer they carried, no frills, no flavor, just the dull burn he needed, and returned to the counter. But as he reached into his pocket, a sinking feeling gripped his stomach. The wad of bills he pulled out was pitiful. Wrinkled ones. A couple of coins, maybe a 5 if he was lucky. He'd miscalculated, forgotten how much he'd spent on gas earlier in the week. And his next disability check? Still 5 days away. Marta's smile faded into concern as she watched him count and recount the cash, his brow furrowed, hands trembling just slightly. "Tommy," she said softly, "you look pale and tired. When was the last time you had a real meal?" He didn't meet her eyes, just shrugged. "It's been a while. I'll come back when my check hits." But Marta didn't move to take the beer back. Instead, she folded her hands on the counter, her gaze steady. "I know it's hard for you," she said, her voice low. "I see the newspaper you carry. I've seen you staring at it for hours in your camper. That kind of pain? It doesn't fade. But maybe you could come with me this Sunday. To church." Tommy blinked at her. "Church?" The instinctual answer rose quickly. No. A firm, hard no. He had been raised on the forced teachings of Catholic priests who preached salvation but delivered something far crueler. He could recite their prayers by heart, remember the sting of their punishments, the lies of their gospel. Christianity had been the language of his erasure, and as for his Navajo traditions, that thread had frayed long ago, tangled in grief and silence until it snapped. "Church isn't for people like me," he muttered. "I don't think your God would want me there." But Marta was undeterred. Her eyes sparkled with something close to mischief. "Tell you what," she said, "you come with me to Sunday service, sit through the whole thing, and I'll buy you this 6-pack. And if you still don't feel any different afterward, I'll throw in 2 more bottles." He stared at her, half amused, half stunned. "You're bribing me with beer to go to church?" She laughed, a sound like wind chimes in the breeze. "Maybe I am. But God works in mysterious ways, and sometimes those ways come in brown glass bottles." It was a ridiculous offer, but also strangely appealing. 8 bottles of beer for an hour of boredom? He had nothing else planned, and if he was honest, he didn't really want to spend another Sunday afternoon alone with his thoughts. "All right," he said after a pause, "but let's be clear. I'm going for the beer, not salvation." Marta's grin widened. "That's good enough for me. Service starts in 30 minutes. Holy martyrs of the desert parish. Just follow the main road, turn left at the big wooden cross. Can you stay sober that long?" He almost asked for 1 bottle in advance, just to settle his nerves, but something in Marta's expression stopped him. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'll be there." Back in his camper, Tommy rifled through a small pile of worn clothing, searching for something halfway presentable. The best he could do was a faded gray T-shirt with fewer holes than the others. He washed his face using water from a plastic jug, combed his fingers through his tangled hair, and tried not to look at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The church wasn't far. A squat adobe structure with rough whitewashed walls stood quietly against the backdrop of the desert hills. A wooden cross was mounted above the door, weathered by years of sun and wind. As he pulled into the gravel lot, Tommy parked his battered camper next to a gleaming sedan, the contrast so stark it made him flinch. He almost turned back. But Marta was there, waiting by the entrance, her eyes lit up like she hadn't had a reason to smile in days. She linked her arm through his without hesitation. "Thank you for coming, Tommy," she said. "I didn't come for God," he reminded her. "I know," she said simply. "But you came." Inside, the church was humble but dignified. Stained glass windows cast ribbons of color across the stone floor. Wooden pews lined the center aisle, worn smooth by generations of worshippers. The altar was draped in white linen and adorned with desert wildflowers. Tommy followed Marta to a pew near the back. He could feel the stares, the polite curiosity. His clothes were out of place. The faint scent of beer still clung to him, but he sat anyway, arms crossed, waiting for the hour to pass. The opening hymn began, voices rising in imperfect harmony. Tommy didn't sing. He didn't pray. He just sat still, watching the light move across the floor, feeling, just for a moment, that maybe silence could be something sacred too. Tommy rose slowly to his feet as the congregation began to sing, his knees creaking in protest. He mumbled along to the hymn, his voice barely audible, the words only half remembered from the forced chapel visits of his boarding school days. They rolled off his tongue more from muscle memory than belief. When the others sat, he followed suit. When they knelt, he remained seated, arms crossed, ignoring the sideways glances cast in his direction. Their disapproval didn't touch him. He had lived too long in exile to be wounded by a stranger's frown. From the corner of his eye, he watched as the priest stepped up to the altar. He was a man in his 50s, tall and lean, with steel-gray hair, and eyes that seemed to hold both weariness and compassion. "That's Father Murphy," Marta whispered beside him. "He's been part of this parish for 15 years, a good man." Tommy gave a non-committal nod, his attention beginning to wander. Something on the far side of the sanctuary caught his eye. Movement, perhaps, or simply a shift in atmosphere. A group of nuns had taken their place near the altar, their black habits distinct from the simpler clothing worn by the local sisters. They stood in silent formation, their faces partially veiled beneath long head coverings, their expressions unreadable. "Do you see them?" he whispered to Marta, gesturing subtly. She followed his gaze and her brow furrowed. "That's unusual," she said. "They're not from around here. Our nuns don't wear robes like that, and they rarely stand up front during service. Must be something special going on today." The habits were longer, darker, and more somber. There was a kind of severity in the way the sisters stood, unmoving, silent, unflinching. Their presence stirred something uneasily familiar in Tommy, evoking memories he thought he'd long buried. The stillness of their postures, the lack of expression, the way they seemed to blend into the background while watching everything, all of it reminded him of his time at St. Gertrude's. The women back then had worn habits like those. They too had watched in silence while children were punished, while heritage was stripped away, one rule, one prayer, one punishment at a time. And yet, there was something else, a quality in their faces, those that weren't completely hidden by veils. Their cheekbones, their skin tones, their quiet intensity. Many of them appeared to be indigenous women. That realization hit Tommy like a sudden gust of wind. His chest tightened. It was rare, almost unheard of, for Native women to join such an order. He didn't know whether to feel moved or troubled. Father Murphy's voice echoed through the sanctuary, but Tommy barely heard it. Snippets reached him. Phrases about faith in adversity, about God's mysterious timing and unseen plans. The message was probably comforting to most, but Tommy's mind was elsewhere. The presence of the nuns had stirred up old feelings, memories of the way things had been, and the aching hole left by the three sisters who never came home. The priest's tone shifted near the end of the service. "Before we close today, I want to share something special," Father Murphy said. "We're honored to be joined this afternoon by the Handmaid Sisters of St. Dinah. They've traveled from their mountain monastery as part of their annual spiritual journey, visiting Catholic churches across New Mexico. This week, they're offering revival blessings and healing prayers to those in need. If you carry burdens, doubts, or wounds, spiritual or otherwise, please consider coming forward to receive their prayers." Marta nudged Tommy gently with her elbow. "You should go," she whispered. "Let them pray for you." He shook his head. "No. I came. I sat through the whole thing. That was the deal." His tone was firm, but not angry. "Then let's head back to the store," Marta said without pushing further. They made their way toward the back exit, but before they could leave, Father Murphy descended the altar steps and made his way toward them. His face lit up as he recognized Marta. "Marta Dane," he said warmly. "Always a blessing to see you. And who is this fine gentleman with you?" Marta introduced Tommy, who accepted the priest's outstretched hand hesitantly. The handshake was firm, the priest's eyes sincere. "It's good to have you here, Thomas," Father Murphy said. "I don't think I've seen you before." Tommy shrugged. "It's been a long time since I set foot in a church. Used to go all the time back at a place I don't talk about. Haven't thought about those old Bible lessons in years, but something in what you said today, I don't know. It stuck with me a little." Father Murphy studied him closely. Perhaps he saw the weariness in Tommy's face, the rawness that hadn't been dulled by age or alcohol. Or maybe it was the way Tommy spoke, like someone holding back a flood of sorrow. "You carry something heavy. the priest said quietly. Tina nodded. You could say that. He didn't elaborate. He didn't mention the photo or the sisters who vanished. That story wasn't for strangers, no matter how kind they seemed. Father Murphy shifted the conversation gently. The sisters, he said, nodding toward the group of nuns still standing near the altar, come from a very secluded community. They live under strict vows, silence, celibacy, prayer. They only break that silence during their yearly mission when they offer prayers for others and deliver written messages afterward. They believe their time in silence allows them to hear God more clearly. He gestured toward a small table at the front of the church. Anyone who wishes can write a prayer request and place it in the box by the candles. When the sisters return to their monastery, they pray over each request. A few weeks later, they write responses, what they believe God has told them, and return those papers to the church. Tommy arched a brow. So they write down what God says? For each individual? That's right, Father Murphy confirmed. Marta touched his arm. Just try. What could it hurt? Tommy hesitated. The idea was strange, even slightly absurd, but his curiosity had been awakened. He'd never heard of anything like this, especially from women who looked like they came from the same world he had. And what if, just what if, God really did have something to say? He walked slowly to the front of the sanctuary. His boots clicked softly on the tiled floor. At the prayer table, he found slips of paper, a pen, and a small stand of flickering candles. He stared at the blank space in front of him, unsure how to begin. His hand trembled slightly as he wrote his name. Then beneath it, carefully, painfully, he scrawled, "Where are my sisters? Nazi. Alisi. Alen? Plizai? Onaite? Aia. Anything." A sister in black approached silently, her presence barely registering until she stood beside him. She bowed slightly and gestured toward the candles. Tommy lit one, the flame leaping to life and casting soft shadows across the table. He crossed himself, awkwardly, self-consciously, and walked toward the box. As he passed the line of nuns, he saw them more clearly. Yes, most were native women. Their features, their posture, even their eyes reminded him of the girls from Cottonwood Bluffs. And suddenly, unbidden, came a surge of recognition. Not memory, but something deeper, a whisper that maybe, just maybe the past was not entirely gone. He dropped his prayer into the box. The flame of his candle flickered gently behind him. The wooden prayer box was packed to its edges, overflowing with folded slips of paper bearing silent hopes and desperate pleas. Tommy had to press his own paper down with deliberate force to make space, his fingers trembling slightly as he did so. As he slipped his prayer into the box, its contents raw and vulnerable, he looked up at the nun stationed closest to it. Something in her stillness, in her presence, made him want to speak. "If what they say is true," he murmured under his breath, his voice barely audible in the hushed sanctuary, "if your God is truly more powerful than the spirits our people have followed for generations, then he should be able to answer one thing. Where are my 3 sisters? Tell me that, and I'll become the most faithful Catholic this church has ever seen." He managed a faint smile as he said it, a fragile gesture born of yearning. He wasn't mocking. He wanted to believe, even if only a tiny, fractured part of him dared to. He wanted to feel that maybe someone in this church, these nuns who looked like him, might understand his pain, might carry his loss with him for just a moment. But none of the sisters returned his smile. Their faces remained impassive, serene, trained in silence. Yet something shifted in their expressions when he mentioned his missing sisters. A flicker of recognition, a ripple of empathy. He couldn't be sure. Their eyes held something deeper, something he couldn't name. He turned to leave, beginning the slow walk back toward Marta and Father Murphy. But instinct drew his gaze back over his shoulder. Just in time he saw the nun who had captured his attention, the one who had guided him to the candle, who had stood silently by the prayer box, lift the heavy wooden container in her arms. She stumbled slightly, favoring her right leg. It was subtle but clear. A limp. She carried the box toward a small door near the altar, likely where the prayers would be stored and later transported to the monastery. As she reached the doorway, a gust of wind from the open side entrance swept into the sanctuary. Her robe fluttered upward, momentarily revealing the side of her face. Tommy's breath caught in his throat. There, just above her cheekbone, along the edge of her left temple, he saw it, a thick, raised scar winding like a narrow river across her skin. Time had faded it, but it was unmistakable. His heart thundered. Naomi! The scar had come from a terrible day at the boarding school. One of the nuns had caught little Eva humming a song in Da during laundry duty. In a fit of rage, the woman struck her with a wooden ruler. Naomi had stepped between them, taking the brunt of the blow. It split her skin open, leaving a mark that never healed clean. She had whispered the story to Tommy during morning mass weeks later, her voice trembling with pain, shame, and something like defiance. And now, that same scar, he was certain of it, had appeared on the face of a nun who should have been gone for 40 years. He opened his mouth to speak, the name forming in his throat, but before the word could escape, the door shut behind her with a soft click. She was gone. Tommy stood frozen, his legs unwilling to move, his hands clenched into fists. For a moment he felt the walls of the church spin around him. Was it real? Could it be? Or had his mind, starved for answers for so long, conjured a vision he desperately wanted to see? Another sister approached from behind, gesturing gently for him to move aside. A small line had formed behind him at the prayer box. Tommy blinked and nodded, mumbling a half apology, then stumbled back to where Marta and Father Murphy were waiting. He arrived pale, shaken, his breathing unsteady. "Sorry to keep you waiting," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "I saw one of the sisters walking. She limped, and it just reminded me of something from a long time ago." Father Murphy looked concerned. "You don't look well. Are you all right?" Tommy inhaled slowly, knowing that the moment had come, perhaps the only moment, when he had to speak what had weighed on him for decades. "Father," he said softly, "I've never told anyone this, but I had 3 younger sisters. They disappeared 40 years ago, taken from St. Gertrude's Indian boarding school in Cottonwood Bluffs. I was there too. We were Navajo. Our father got arrested for trying to stop the land agents, and our mother had died giving birth to the youngest. They called us Words of the State and sent us to that school." Father Murphy's brow furrowed deeply, a sorrowed silence stretching between them. "There was a press day," Tommy continued, his voice steadier now that he had begun. "Photographers came to take pictures for the papers. My sisters were chosen for the photo because they were young and scared and beautiful, and that made for good propaganda. The next day, they were gone." He paused, looking at his hands as they trembled in front of him. "The school staff wouldn't answer me. They told me to forget them. When I refused, they locked me up, beat me, tried to erase even the memory of them." He swallowed hard. "Years later I went back. The school was abandoned, nothing left but dust and silence. And I've been searching ever since. But I never found anything, until now." Marta reached for his arm, steadying him gently. "I saw that nun," he whispered. "The scar on her temple? I know it. Naomi had that scar. I saw it up close. I remember the day she got it. That woman who just left the room. It could be her. It has to be her." Father Murphy placed a hand on Tommy's shoulder. "I can't imagine the pain you've lived with," he said. "But maybe, just maybe, this is where your answers begin. Perhaps that prayer you wrote down is already being answered." "I want to believe that," Tommy said. "I do. But even if it's her, what do I do? How do I forgive what happened to us? How do I let go of the rage I've carried all this time? I drink to forget, but nothing works." Father Murphy's eyes softened. "Have you heard the story of Abraham?" he asked. "He waited decades for God to fulfill his promise. Even when hope seemed lost, he held on. God's timing isn't ours, but his answers do come when we're ready to hear them." He gestured to the altar. "I believe you should wait for the sisters' response. I've seen the words they've sent back. Deeply personal, often profound. Maybe this is how you'll finally learn what became of your sisters." Tommy nodded slowly, but another question bubbled to the surface. "Father, Tell me more about these nuns. The Handmaid Sisters of St. Dinah? Why are so many of them native? Who started this?" And this, Father Murphy's expression changed. There was hesitation in his voice now. "The order was founded by Father Milford many years ago. A deeply devout man, some say visionary. When he passed, his son, Father Milford II, continued the ministry. But I must be honest. The origins of the Handmaid Sisters are not something we're encouraged to discuss. They are considered sacred." Tommy frowned. "Sacred? Or secret?" Father Murphy hesitated, then looked away. "They serve a purpose beyond our understanding." "But why are most of the nuns indigenous?" Tommy pressed, his voice more forceful than he intended. "And where is their monastery? I'd like to visit them, understand their work better." Father Murphy's smile disappeared. He shook his head slowly, a firm finality in the gesture. "I'm sorry, but I can't provide that information. The Handmaid Sisters of St. Dinah are a cloistered Catholic mission, very private, reclusive. They operate what they call a sanctuary, a place of prayer and penance. The sisters have taken strict vows of silence, modesty, and isolation. No visitors, no contact. They only emerge once a year to tour the churches across New Mexico. That's the only time the public sees them." Tommy watched the priest closely, sensing there was more he wasn't saying. There was something in Father Murphy's eyes, a flicker of tension, like a man guarding a locked door within himself. Whatever lay behind that door, Tommy wasn't going to get through it today. The priest's posture told him the conversation was over. Before the silence could grow awkward, Marta stepped forward with a bright smile. "Well, Tommy," she said lightly, "a deal is a deal. Let's go get your beer." They thanked the priest and stepped out into the blinding afternoon sun. The gravel in the parking lot shimmered with heat, the air wavy and distorted. It was the kind of heat that stuck to your skin and made time feel slower. "I'll meet you back at the store," Marta said as she unlocked her car. "Drive safe." Tommy nodded and climbed into his camper. The vehicle groaned as it started, a sound that matched the unease churning in his gut. He rolled through the dusty streets of Whispering Rock with the windows down, trying to clear his head. Back at the liquor store, Marta made good on her promise. She handed over 8 cold bottles, her eyes full of concern and kindness. "Try not to drink all 8 in one go," she said gently. "And maybe, just maybe, we'll go to church again next week?" Tommy managed a half smile, but didn't reply. His mind was still on the scar, the limp, the prayer. He took the bottles, thanked her quietly, and headed back toward the outskirts of town. As he reached his camper, something caught his eye. Tucked beneath his windshield wiper was a piece of paper. Curious, he pulled it free. It was a flyer, printed on thick, cream-colored cardstock, announcing the Handmaid Sisters of St. Dinah's annual church tour. The flyer listed the names and dates of every parish they would visit over the next several weeks. Tommy scanned the flyer, flipping it over in search of more. There was no return address, no mention of a monastery location. Just a brief note at the bottom. Prayer requests must be submitted in person during church visits. No outside correspondence accepted. He opened a beer and took a long swallow, the cold liquid offering temporary relief from the fire in his chest. But as he sipped, he looked up and saw the sisters. Through his dusty windshield, he spotted the 5 nuns emerging from Holy Martyrs of the Desert Parish. They moved in silence, climbing into a plain white van with no logos or plates, only a small cross painted near the rear bumper. A young church volunteer followed, carrying several cardboard boxes that Tommy assumed contained the prayer slips. He loaded them carefully into the back of the van and closed the doors. Tommy's heart thudded. He grabbed the flyer again, reading every word this time. Still no address, no clues. Father Murphy hadn't lied, but he also hadn't told him everything. And that van was about to leave. In a split-second decision, Tommy tossed the flyer onto the passenger seat, started the engine, and slowly pulled out of his spot. He kept his distance, watching the van as it turned onto the main road. His plan to return to his usual parking spot evaporated, replaced by something more urgent. Curiosity, yes, but more than that. Need. Need to know if Naomi really stood among them. Need to find out what happened all those years ago. The van headed east, toward the mountains. Tommy followed, always staying several car lengths behind. The further they drove from town, the more desolate the landscape became. Scraggly brush lined the roadside, and yellow grasses bowed to the wind. Occasionally the road passed broken fence posts or rusting mailboxes marking long-abandoned homesteads. They drove for nearly an hour. No signs, no towns, just wilderness. Then, up ahead, something emerged from the mirage of heat and dust. A large, fenced-in compound. Chain-link fencing rose high around the perimeter, topped not with barbed wire but with strips of colored cloth fluttering in the wind. Prayer flags, perhaps. A gate blocked the entrance, sturdy and locked. Beside it stood a small guard post, constructed from cinder blocks and shaded by a rusted metal awning. Tommy slowed and pulled off the road, parking behind a patch of brush. He turned off his engine and watched. The van approached the gate and came to a stop. A young man, native maybe in his 20s, stepped out of the guard post. He wore a black uniform and a serious expression. After scanning the area, he waved the van through. The gate opened with mechanical precision, then closed again just as quickly. From his hidden position, Tommy studied the compound. It wasn't what he had expected at all. The buildings inside were low and blocky, built for function, not beauty. No stained glass, no bell towers, no gardens or fountains. The structures looked institutional, like military housing or a detention facility. Gray, flat-roofed, and soulless. Tommy's stomach turned. He had imagined a monastery nestled in the hills, a quiet retreat of peace and prayer. But this place had the feel of secrecy, of control. He waited. For 30 minutes, he watched. Nothing moved beyond the fences. Only the prayer flags danced in the hot afternoon breeze. No voices, no music, no bells. He reached beneath his seat and pulled out a wooden cigar box. Its surface was worn smooth from years of handling, its finish faded by sun and time. The lid creaked softly as he opened it. Inside were the fragments of a life he had never stopped mourning. Photographs. Old, fragile, brittle with age. Black and white images of children in matching uniforms, standing in rows in front of chapel buildings. Their expressions were blank, eyes dulled by obedience and fear. He ran a finger over one particular photo. His sisters, barely more than toddlers, seated on the steps of St. Gertrude's. Their braids are perfect. Their dresses are crisp. Their smiles, non-existent. This place, this compound, it felt too familiar, too much like what they had escaped. And yet, he wondered, had they escaped at all? Among the keepsakes tucked away inside the worn cigar box, there was one item Tommy treasured above all others. A photograph so precious he dared not look at it too often, lest he wear it out with longing. It was a candid shot, unposed and genuine, showing his 3 sisters, seated together on the stone steps of the girls' dormitory. The moment had been captured by a kitchen worker, a quiet woman of Pueblo descent who had taken pity on the siblings and handed the photo to Tommy in secret, her eyes filled with something close to sorrow. He had hidden it for decades, folding and unfolding it with reverence, protecting it like a sacred relic from a forgotten life. Beneath the stack of photographs lay something even more sacred, a pendant of turquoise set in hand-hammered silver, suspended from a leather cord darkened by sweat, sun, and age. Tommy lifted it from the box with both hands, cradling it gently in his palm. The turquoise was vibrant, robin's egg blue, streaked with darker veins like dried riverbeds across a desert floor. It was beautiful, untouched by time, yet softened by years of wear. His father had crafted 4 identical pendants in the winter just before everything changed. One for each of his children, shaped with care in his workshop, warmed by fire and blessed with prayer. To remember who you are, he had said, even when the world tries to make you forget. The moment they were taken, the authorities tried to confiscate the necklaces, calling them inappropriate tribal jewelry. But Tommy, the oldest, had hidden his beneath his shirt and never taken it off, not for long. He turned the pendant over, tracing the back where the old Navajo script was etched deep into the silver. Ashki Yaji, his real name, the one given to him by his father and grandmother. The one stolen by the boarding school system, replaced with Tommy, as if that could erase centuries of language and tradition. He whispered the name now like a prayer, feeling it vibrate in his chest. His father had said the pendant would keep him safe, grounded, connected to those who came before. And now, as he sat in a dusty camper on the edge of a strange compound, the same pendant steadied him once again. There was one more item inside the box, a crumpled piece of paper that looked worthless, but meant everything. It was an old lunch menu from the boarding school cafeteria, printed in faded ink on cheap, brittle paper. But the value wasn't in the menu, it was on the back. There, sketched in pencil so long ago, was an image Tommy had drawn during one of countless sleepless nights. 3 girls, seated together in a tender tableau, Naomi gently braiding Eva's hair, while Sarah sat nearby, her mouth open mid-song. It was a memory, burned into his brain, rendered with the delicate precision of someone who had once believed art could offer escape. Drawing had been Tommy's only solace in the boarding school. A stolen hour with pencil and paper was a sanctuary where he could recreate the world as it should have been, loving, safe, whole. Now, looking at the sketch again, he compared it to the face of the limping nun he'd seen at the church, the shape of the eyes, the curve of the mouth, and above all else, the scar. That unmistakable scar that traced her left temple. Naomi's scar. His breath caught. The world narrowed. The memory of that injury was seared into him. Naomi had shielded little Eva from a cruel nun's fury, intercepting a blow meant for her younger sister. The wooden ruler had split her skin wide open. It had bled for hours. It had healed poorly. That scar was a story, a testament, a wound that could not be faked. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden mechanical clang, the gate of the compound groaning open. He looked up in time to see a modest sedan rolling out of the facility. Behind it, through the briefly opened gate, Tommy glimpsed the inner courtyard. 2 nuns stood near the main building, their arms wrapped around each other in a tearful embrace. One seemed to be sobbing. The other gently rubbed her back, comforting her. Before Tommy could absorb the sight, a third figure appeared, a man, not in robes, dressed like a civilian. He stepped in and firmly guided both women away from view. The gate closed behind them with a final metallic snap. Tommy frowned, unsettled. Why would nuns be crying in a sanctuary? Wasn't this place supposed to be holy, peaceful? Something wasn't right. He hadn't even finished his first beer, so he knew he wasn't imagining it. The sedan disappeared down the road, too far for him to follow unnoticed. Still shaken, Tommy slipped the pendant over his head, letting it settle against his chest. Its familiar weight grounded him, reminded him who he was and why he had come. He climbed out of his camper and made the slow, cautious walk toward the compound gate. The desert terrain was uneven, and the sun beat down without mercy. When he reached the gate, the young Navajo man stationed at the guardhouse stepped forward. His expression was unreadable, but his hand rested lightly on a 2-way radio clipped to his belt. "You can't be here," the guard said flatly. "Private property, no access." Tommy raised both hands slowly. "I'm not here to cause trouble, brother. I just want to know, is this really the monastery for the Handmaid Sisters of St. Dinah? I'd like to speak to Father Milford, the second one." The guard's gaze narrowed. "Why are you looking for him? His office isn't here. It's in Santa Dolorosa. Only the sisters live on this property." Tommy didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached under his shirt and drew out the turquoise pendant. It caught the afternoon light, flashing blue and silver. The guard's face changed. He stared at the necklace, recognizing the craftsmanship, the sacredness. For a long moment, they looked at each other. 2 Navajo men in a land that had tried to strip them of their culture. And yet here they stood, bound by a symbol that still meant something. Finally, the guard's voice softened. "I can't tell you much, but if you're looking for answers, you need to talk to Father Milford II yourself. His office is in Santa Rosa. Follow the east road for about 30 miles. He hesitated, then added, Don't tell anyone I gave you that. It's not safe for people like us to hang around here too long." Tommy nodded, backing away slowly. "I hear you," he said, "and thank you." Tommy had started to turn away, his conversation with the watchman concluded, when something made him pause mid-step. He turned back, the question forming before he could suppress it. "Brother," he said, voice quiet but firm, "are the sisters safe in there?" The young Navajo man didn't respond at first, his jaw tightened slightly. "I saw some of them at church earlier today," Tommy continued. "Most of them looked like us, indigenous, and just now I saw nuns crying inside your gate, embracing each other. One of them looked like she was in pain." His voice dropped lower, more personal. "Are they being saved here, or is something else going on?" The watchman's expression didn't change, but a flicker of emotion, fear, passed through his eyes. It was fleeting, but unmistakable. "We all play our parts here," he said finally, his voice a whisper of sand over stone. "My part is to keep my mouth shut and protect the people I care about. That's all I can say." Then his tone shifted, becoming urgent. "Go, now. I've helped you enough. Don't stay here any longer." Tommy gave a respectful nod, understanding more in what wasn't said than what was. He turned and walked back to his camper, the turquoise pendant warm against his chest. The road to Santa Dora Rosa wound through red rock canyons and sparse stretches of desert pines. As his camper climbed into higher elevations, the oppressive desert heat gave way to a cooler breeze that swept through the open windows. The sun still blazed overhead, but the air held a crispness now, a reminder that mountains were not far away. It was late afternoon when Tommy approached the outskirts of the town. A strange sense of recognition hit him as he passed a familiar bend in the road. The layout of the houses, the way they nestled against the low mountain slope, it triggered something deep in his memory. As he rolled past the welcome sign, he blinked at the rusted metal beneath newer paint. Faded letters peeked through. Cielo Seco. Tommy pulled over, staring at the old sign as a flood of memory surged through him. He had been here before. 20 years ago, he had passed through Cielo Seco during one of the most desperate stretches of his search. He remembered meeting a kind man, a botanist, maybe a researcher, who had been cataloging desert plant life in the nearby canyons. Tommy had been following a trail of rumors about missing indigenous children and had nearly fallen into a narrow crevice hidden beneath loose gravel. That stranger had caught his arm just in time, pulling him to safety. They'd spoken briefly. The man had given him water, shared his lunch, and wished him luck. It was a rare act of kindness during years defined by indifference. But Tommy didn't linger on the memory. He had a purpose now. The camper was running low on gas, and his wallet held barely enough to refill it once more. He passed a gas station and considered buying a local map, but decided he couldn't spare the money. Instead, he stopped at a diner, a general store, and finally a small mechanic's garage, asking about an address that had been whispered to him by a nervous guard. Most people shook their heads, unfamiliar, but eventually a tired clerk pointed him toward a quiet residential street on the edge of town. When Tommy arrived, his breath caught. Parked in front of a modest, single-story adobe house was the same unmarked sedan he had seen leaving the compound earlier that day. The car's hood was warm, indicating it had been driven recently. The building itself looked nothing like what he had imagined. It wasn't a rectory or a church office. It resembled any other family home in Santa Rosa: white stucco walls, red-tiled roof, a narrow gravel walkway flanked by desert plants. Tommy parked across the street and stared at the front door. Something about this place felt off, too normal. He touched the turquoise pendant at his chest for strength and approached. His plan was simple. Ask to speak with Father Milford II. Ask about the monastery, about the indigenous women, about whether he had heard stories, anything, about 3 sisters who had once vanished from a place called St. Gertrude's. He knocked. Once, twice. The door creaked open slightly under the force of his hand. Unlatched. "Hello," Tommy called, pushing the door open wider. "Father Milford, I'm here to talk about the monastery." No response. Inside, the air was still. The living room was modest, with well-worn furniture and religious art on the walls, a crucifix above the mantel, a rosary draped across a lampshade. Everything neat. Too neat. Then he saw them. Streaks on the floor, dark lines of dust and smears across the tile, like something heavy had been dragged through the house. "Is anyone here?" Tommy called again, his voice echoing faintly. He followed the trail down a narrow hallway. The streaks became more defined, as did other marks, faint but unmistakable red smudges across the white walls. They looked like fingernail scrapes clawing at plaster. The hallway ended at a back door, cracked open, leading into a rocky clearing that met the base of the mountainside. There, carved directly into the slope, was a stairwell. Stone steps leading down into shadow, partially concealed by shrubs and scrub brush. At first, Tommy thought it might be a wine cellar. But then he heard it. A woman's voice, crying, pleading. Then, a sharp crack, like a whip, or a leather strap against skin. His blood went cold. Beneath the cries came the drone of a male voice, intoning scripture with a terrifying fervor. "The Lord shall punish the wicked and cast down false gods." Another crack. "Discipline purifies the soul and drives out the heathen spirits." Tommy crept closer, his footsteps nearly silent on the packed earth. At the base of the stairs, through a narrow arch of stone, flickering candlelight danced across the rough interior walls. Shadows moved inside, distorted figures, bent and trembling. He clenched his jaw, every muscle taut with instinct. Something evil was happening here, and it had the language of salvation. The cries echoing from within the stone cellar grew sharper, more desperate, agonized pleas punctuated by the unmistakable sound of something heavy lashing against flesh. Tommy's breath hitched. His body went rigid, frozen by the horror rising up from that cave like a sickness. Then, movement. From the mouth of the shadowed cave, a figure began to ascend the narrow staircase. Someone clad in religious robes. Their face was not visible, hidden beneath the deep cowl of a black habit, but the pace was slow, deliberate, like a ritual more than a retreat. That moment shattered any lingering illusion Tommy had held. This was not a holy site, not a place of sanctuary or divine service. It was a chamber of torment, dressed in the language of faith. Without a second thought, Tommy turned and fled. He moved silently but swiftly, retracing his steps through the modest house, its walls now suffocating. He slipped through the front door and slammed it shut behind him, the noise sharp in the stillness of the afternoon. His hands trembled violently as he fumbled with the keys to his camper, heart hammering, lungs drawing quick, shallow breaths. When the engine finally roared to life, he peeled out of the driveway, gravel scattering behind his tires. He didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. What he had seen would already be burned into his mind forever. He needed help. Now. The police station wasn't hard to find. It sat at the edge of the town square, a squat building with faded paint and a flag that snapped in the high desert wind. 2 patrol cars were parked in front. Tommy pulled into the lot, turned off the engine, and forced himself to breathe. "You can do this," he told himself. "You have to do this." Inside, the station smelled like stale coffee and dust, old linoleum floors, buzzing fluorescent lights, and the faint scent of cigarette smoke that never quite left the air. 2 officers sat behind mismatched metal desks, their postures relaxed, their attention only mildly diverted when the door burst open. Tommy didn't wait for permission. "I need to report a crime," he said, breathless. "There's a woman, maybe more, being tortured in a basement at Father Milford II's residence. I heard screaming, whipping sounds. He's doing something terrible down there. Someone needs to go right now." The older of the 2 officers, a broad man with thinning gray hair and a weathered sheriff's badge pinned to his chest, looked Tommy over with a sneer of disinterest. "Slow down there, Chief," he said, voice thick with condescension. "Start with your name, and tell me exactly what it is you think you saw." Handcuffs clicked shut around Father Milford's wrists, as well as those of his 2 assistants. As the priest was guided toward a squad car, he jerked his head toward Tommy, venom spilling from his eyes. "Your false ancestral gods are powerless," he spat. "I was saving those girls, cleansing them of their pagan corruption. My faith is the one true way." A nearby officer silently pushed the priest's head down and helped him into the car, closing the door with a definitive thud. Naomi, though barely conscious, raised her hand weakly as EMTs began cleaning the wounds on her back. "I am no longer a nun," she declared, her voice hoarse but resolute. "Not as of this moment. Do what you need to do." The medical team discovered lash marks across her back, her arms, and her legs. Bruises are in different stages of healing, needle marks. They administered fluids and oxygen. All the while, she remained lucid, her eyes locked on Tommy. Joe approached them again, his expression somber. "We searched the chamber," he said. "It's worse than we thought. Communion wine was present, but the space was designed for more than storage. He was forcing her to drink during the abuse. There's also something else." Naomi nodded, lifting her chin slightly despite the pain. "He said the wine opened our spirits, allowed divine visions to reach us. When we couldn't provide the messages he expected, he punished us." "There's a large statue of the Virgin Mary," Joe added, "but also a table arranged with symbols from traditional Navajo spirituality." He was mixing the two in a grotesque form of hybrid ritual. Naomi gave a bitter laugh, her voice still rough. He believed indigenous women had closer access to the spirit world, that we could speak more clearly to Mary. We were forced to interpret prayer requests. We became vessels. That's why we were chosen. Clyde clenched his fists. That's perverse on so many levels. It's not faith, it's manipulation." Naomi continued, her voice stronger now, driven by the need to testify. "Only the native nuns were beaten. The white sisters were left alone. He fed us wine until we were too dizzy to resist, then demanded visions. When I refused to fake them, I was punished harder than ever before." Tommy knelt beside her, his hand finding hers. "What about Sarah and Eva?" he asked gently. "Are they alive? Are they safe?" Naomi's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "They faked visions, memorized scripture, played the part. I stayed behind because I wanted to be the last one punished, to protect them as long as I could." She took a breath. "They're still at the monastery, waiting for rescue." Joe placed a firm hand on Tommy's shoulder. "We're working with state authorities now. We'll coordinate a raid on the compound. You'll have your sisters back. All of them." As Naomi was carefully lifted into the ambulance, Tommy climbed in beside her. Clyde followed in his truck as the vehicle pulled away, sirens cutting through the desert air. The setting sun cast an orange haze across the dry land as the town receded behind them. At the regional hospital, Tommy sat in the waiting room beside Clyde. The space was cold and sterile, filled with antiseptic and silence. Time passed slowly. "A life for a life," Tommy murmured, staring at the linoleum floor. "You saved mine back then, and now you've helped save theirs." Clyde nodded solemnly. "That's how it should be. Navajo brothers looking out for each other, especially when no one else will." They spent the next hour reconnecting, piecing together the decades that had passed like fragments of an old song once half remembered. Clyde spoke of his life, how he had continued his botanical research, eventually settling in Albuquerque with his wife, a schoolteacher, and raising 2 children. His days were spent studying plants and desert ecosystems, but in quiet moments he often wondered what became of the weathered, haunted man he had encountered in the mountains so many years ago, the man who had been clinging to a single mission, finding his sisters. "I never stopped looking," Tommy admitted, his voice rough. 40 years of wandering, following dead ends and whispers, praying each time I met an indigenous woman that she might know something. I've lived in that rusted-out camper for decades, Clyde, just sitting in Whispering Rock, watching the world forget about people like us." Clyde didn't try to offer comfort. He simply nodded, understanding the weight behind Tommy's words. Their conversation was interrupted when a nurse approached, clipboard in hand. "Are you the family of the woman brought in from Santa Dua Rosa?" she asked gently. "Yes," Tommy said, rising to his feet quickly. "How is she? Is she awake?" "She's stable," the nurse replied. "The police will be in shortly to take statements, but I can give you an update. We've flushed the alcohol from her system and administered fluids. She's alert and conscious now, though her injuries are extensive. Multiple lacerations, some requiring stitches. She'll need time to recover, physically and emotionally. But she's going to be okay." Tommy exhaled, his shoulders dropping in relief. But before he could say anything more, a stir at the hospital's main entrance drew their attention. Joe, the tribal police officer, was walking in, flanked by two women in long black habits. Even across the bustling lobby, Tommy recognized them instantly. Though older, with faces marked by hardship and eyes shadowed by memory, they were unmistakably his sisters. Sarah was the first to spot him. She stopped mid-stride, one hand flying to her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. Ava stood beside her, eyes narrowing in confusion. Until, in a heartbeat, recognition lit her face. Tommy rose slowly, as though afraid the moment might vanish if he moved too fast. But it didn't. All three moved toward each other at once, drawn together by a bond that had survived despite everything. "Nasli," Tommy whispered as he wrapped his arms around Sarah, using her given Navajo name. "Navajo name, Ellen," he said, holding Ava tightly as she wept into his shoulder. "Ashki Yaji," Sarah replied through sobs, her voice shaking with emotion. "We never thought, never dared hope." They clung to each other, time collapsing around them. Tommy reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a fragile piece of paper, unfolded it with trembling hands. "Do you remember this?" he asked. It was his sketch, the drawing he had made decades ago by candlelight in the dormitory. It showed Naomi braiding Ava's hair while Sarah sat nearby, singing. All three women gasped. "You drew this after chapel," Sarah murmured. "You hid it under your mattress. I remember." "Where's Elise?" Ava asked quietly, using Naomi's birth name. "Is she safe?" "She's here," Tommy assured them, "in treatment. She's going to be all right." Joe approached respectfully. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, "but we need statements. The state and federal authorities are coordinating. What we've uncovered so far suggests serious crime spanning decades." They moved to a private consultation room where Joe placed a small audio recorder on the table. Clyde and Tommy recounted their version of events, describing the church service, the nun with the limp, following the van, and witnessing the torture. Then it was Sarah and Ava's turn. Joe leaned forward. "Tell me what happened in 1945. Why did you disappear from the boarding school?" Sarah's voice trembled but steadied with each word. "Reporters came to St. Gertrude. Government officials. The school had us cleaned up, dressed in borrowed clothes from church donors. They arranged us like decorations, perfect little brown children. The youngest got the most attention. Ava and I were the favorites for their photos." After the session, Ava added, "Father Reginald Milford came to us. He said we had been chosen, that the Virgin Mary had spoken to him and called us special. He promised salvation if we followed him." "The school staff knew," Sarah said bitterly. "They didn't stop him. They led us through back halls to a small prayer room. Then that same night he took us away." "Where?" Joe asked. "To the monastery," Sarah replied. "Back then, it was near a small town called Cielo Seco. That place is now Santa Dora Rosa." Tommy felt a chill run down his spine. "The May kept us cloistered," Ava said. "No talking, constant prayer. If we spoke out or questioned anything, we were punished." "What kind of punishment?" Joe asked. "Whippings," Sarah said flatly. "Public and private. Confession sessions where we were stripped and told to repent. He said pain would cleanse our spirits." "Why didn't you try to escape?" Joe asked. "We were children," Sarah answered, "and we'd been trained for obedience. We were told if we left we'd be damned, and no one would believe us." Ava's voice turned hollow. "And they didn't." Joe asked one final question. "What was the purpose of the prayer responses?" "To convince the public of miracles," Sarah replied. "They made us drink wine until we hallucinated. Then we were told to write down divine messages in response to prayer requests." They believed Navajo girls had a stronger connection to the Virgin Mary. "We weren't the only ones," Ava added. "There were others, girls taken from other boarding schools, other tribes. Some didn't survive." The room fell into heavy silence. Tommy reached for his sister's hands, holding them tightly. "We're together now. We're alive." Joe stood and turned off the recorder. "This is only the beginning of an investigation, but you've done something powerful here, something just and necessary. We'll make sure no more girls disappear, not like this, not ever again." As we matured within that isolated world, slowly surrendering our identities to the demands of silence and obedience, we learned how to avoid his attention, Eva said, her voice trembling yet steady. But he still found ways to exploit us. It wasn't physical abuse anymore, it was spiritual manipulation. She paused, then continued, "We were forced to offer prayers for endless requests that came from people, corporations, wealthy donors, politicians, anyone who paid the monastery for divine guidance. They wanted answers, and we were the ones told to provide them." Tommy looked stunned, still absorbing the magnitude of what she was describing. "We were required to drink wine," Eva added, "sometimes heavily. Then we'd perform these twisted versions of Navajo rituals combined with Catholic prayers. It was all designed to produce some kind of divine vision. Then we'd write down messages, made-up messages, sometimes just things we imagined in our foggy state. Father Milford said those messages were sacred." Her voice grew colder. "He called it our holy gift. I called it surviving." Joe, the tribal police officer, paused in his note-taking. "So the point of all this, mixing traditions, inducing visions, it was all about keeping the money flowing?" "Yes," Eva replied, nodding. "The fusion of indigenous spirituality and Catholic mysticism made the operation incredibly appealing to a certain kind of donor. People desperate for miracles, for blessings, for redemption. They believed that native prayers carried more weight, that somehow we were closer to the divine." She clenched her fists in her lap. "They paid handsomely for it, and we struggled to keep those donations coming." Tommy, listening with a mix of horror and awe, asked the question that had haunted him for decades. "Why didn't anyone ever find you?" "I searched. I've been searching since 1945. I followed every whisper, every rumor, every lead, and nothing." Joe answered, his tone grave. "Because the system didn't want you to find them. In 1945, racial discrimination wasn't just common, it was written into law. Missing Native girls didn't merit police reports. There were no search parties, no journalists asking questions." He looked around the room at the gathered siblings. Boarding schools could, and often did, move children at will. They didn't need to notify families or keep accurate records. Your sisters were never officially declared missing. The school's records say they were reunited with family, which meant they supposedly went to live with a white Christian family for adoption, but that never happened. It was a lie, to cover their transfer into Father Milford's care. Tommy's jaw tightened. "I've carried this newspaper clipping for 40 years, he said, pulling the yellowed article from his shirt pocket. "The photo of you girls on that chapel porch, and him standing behind you." He held it out, his hands shaking. "I always thought maybe it was the journalist or someone from the outside who took you. I never thought it was the priest in the picture." Just then a nurse stepped into the room, holding a clipboard. "The patient in room 12 is asking for her family," she said with a gentle smile. "She's awake, stable, and ready for visitors." The four of them made their way to Naomi's hospital room. When they entered, they found her sitting up in bed, looking frail but lucid. Her wounds had been cleaned, her body bandaged, and an IV dripped slowly into her arm. When she saw all three siblings together, Tommy, Sarah, and Eva, Naomi's breath hitched. Her eyes filled with tears. "I never thought I'd see this day," she whispered, her voice hoarse with emotion. "A man may keep—" Tommy moved to her side and took her hand. "You were standing right there, at that church this morning," he said, tears in his eyes, "next to the prayer box. You were so close. If only I had known." Naomi gripped his fingers gently. "It wasn't time yet, brother," she said. "But now we're together. Whether it was the Christian God or the spirits of our ancestors, or both, something answered your prayer. Not in words, but in action." Eva stepped forward, her expression contemplative. "I still believe in some of what we were taught," she admitted. "The core teachings of Catholicism, they have power. But those men, the milords, they corrupted it. They twisted faith into something cruel, something poisonous. Tommy nodded slowly. Maybe, he said, when you've healed. When we've all healed. We can try again, start over, find a way to reclaim our beliefs. A faith that doesn't require us to erase who we are as Navajo people. The four siblings sat there, hand in hand, silent for a moment, as the weight of their history settled between them, not crushing them, but connecting them. For the first time in decades, they were no longer just survivors. They were family, reunited, whole. And Tommy, after 4 decades of wandering, finally felt at peace.